China did in 40 years what most countries can't do in 100. In the late 1970s, China was one of the poorest nations in the world. Its cities were underdeveloped. Its people were trapped in poverty. And the scars of the Great Leap still haunted its streets. Fast forward to today, and the story of China has flipped completely. From 1979 onwards, China averaged nearly 10% GDP growth rate per year. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. Per capita GDP rose from under $200 in 1980s to over $13,000 as of last year. China today is the second largest economy in the world in terms of GDP and the largest adjusted for purchasing power parity. And look at this transformation firsthand. Shenzhen used to be a fishing village, and today it looks like this. It is a trailblazer in technology. So the big question is, how did a poor communist country become the factory of the world, a tech powerhouse, and a global superpower all at the same time? And why did India fall behind, and what can we learn from them? A year that holds great importance for India is 1947, because that was when we gained independence. A similar year for China is 1949. In 1949, the Chinese Civil War ended and People's Republic of China came into existence. The leader of China back then was Mao Zedong. Both India and China were largely agrarian economies and were recovering from decades of exploitation and internal turmoil. In the 1950s and early 1960s, India's economy was slightly better off than China's. India also had a stronger entrepreneurial class, a relatively more democratic system, and better ties with the West. Another similarity between the two nations was that both India and China adopted a socialist style of governance. India's Nehruvian socialism emphasized on planning, public sector undertaking, and import substitution. China under Mao, however, had an even more radical approach, which, by the way, destroyed their economy. But before I get to that, let me set the record and my stance straight. Mao Zedong deserves a lot of appreciation for some of the work that he did for China. Under him, literacy rates improved drastically from under 20% in 1949 to over 60% by 1970s. Education was extended to rural areas for the first time. Mao also succeeded tremendously when it came to uniting the country under a central authority for the first time in decades. He also refused to be a pawn in the Cold War geopolitics and maintaining China's independence from both the US and Soviet Union. But when it came to economy, just as I stated before, he was a disaster. Mao Zedong was a firm believer in centrally planned economy rooted in Marxist and Leninist ideology. Under him, state-controlled means of all production and private ownership was virtually abolished. This basically means that there were no private enterprises. His policies such as the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution destroyed its economy and society. Let's talk about the Great Leap Forward, for instance. It was honestly a great leap backward. The Great Leap Forward was Mao's radical plan to turn China from an agrarian society to an industrial superpower. The problem was that it tried to do it overnight. Villages were merged into giant public communes. It basically meant that everybody that was farming for the country and not for themselves. Private farming was banned, and millions were forced to produce steel in the backyard furnaces, often by melting pots and pans. At the same time, grain production was grossly exaggerated to impress party leaders. Let me explain. Think of a country as big as India or China. The country has several states. Each of these states has multiple districts, and each of these districts has multiple sub-districts, also known as tehsils. And now each tehsil has several villages. For instance, it is estimated that India alone has 650,000 or 6.5 lakh villages as per census of 2011. The number in China is even bigger at 800,000 or 8 lakhs. Now one village has multiple farms, right? To impress the head of the village, who represented the government, the farmers exaggerated how much they produced. The boss of the village further exaggerated the village's produce to the head of the tehsil or the sub-district, and this individual further exaggerated it to the head of the district. You get the idea. The head of the district further exaggerated the figures to the head of the state, and the heads of state collectively exaggerated the figures to Mao, who was at the center of it all. What happened as a result of it? The government over-anticipated the amount of crop that was produced. Officials hid the truth, and as a result of that, government seized more food than what even existed, and farmers were left to starve. Some even resorted to eating tree barks and soil. It is estimated that at least 30 million people or 3 crore people lost their lives. and it was considered the worst man-made famine in history. Instead of leaping forward, China stumbled into a catastrophe. Now there's a reason why centrally planned economies fail. It is because a small group of people, the government, try to control almost everything. What gets made, how much gets made, who gets it, and at what price, instead of letting businesses and consumers decide based on supply and demand, what is also known as the free market in economics. In centrally planned economies, they also make another mistake, which is to force policies or decisions which they feel is right but might not actually be right. A great example of this is the Sparrow Crisis, also known as the Four Pest Campaign. The Sparrow Crisis was one of Mao Zedong's bizarre environmental decisions during the Great Leap Forward, and it had deadly consequences. Mao declared a war on four pests: rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows, particularly the Eurasian tree sparrow. He blamed them for eating grains and reducing crop yields. Citizens across China were asked to mobilize and kill sparrows. Millions of sparrows were killed. But here's the twist: sparrows also eat insects, particularly locusts. With no sparrows to keep locust population in check, the locust population exploded and it went on to destroy crops. The ecological imbalance further worsened the famine, and guess what happened as a result of it? The situation became so bad that China had to import sparrows from the Soviet Union just to keep things in check. These were just two of the several missteps that happened under Mao. As a result of it, by 1970s, China was in a deep crisis. Famines, stagnation, and internal chaos had left the country exhausted. But then after his death, a new leader rose to power, and he was set to transform China's economy and its image: Deng Xiaoping. Mao viewed profits and private enterprises as inherently capitalist and corrupting, and believed that economic growth must also serve the revolutionary goals of socialism. In contrast, Deng Xiaoping was a far more pragmatic leader. He had a famous saying: "It doesn't matter if a cat is white or black, as long as it kills mice." What this means basically is that he does not care about the ideology which is used as long as it yields results. He undid a lot of the mistakes made by Mao and turned China from a rigid, centrally planned and socialist economy to a market-oriented and kind of capitalist one. His actions are collectively called reform and opening up. Reform refers to domestic economic restructuring, losing central power, allowing private enterprises, and improving productivity. Opening up meant welcoming foreign investments, promoting exports, and engaging with global institutions and markets. Now, do remember that at this point in time as well, China was largely an agrarian economy. His first action was to dismantle the commune farming system which Mao created, and he basically allowed farmers to lease land and sell their surplus in the market after meeting the limited state quotas. As a result of this, agricultural productivity soared, rural incomes increased, and poverty rates declined very drastically. While estimates vary, they broadly suggest that poverty rates in China declined from over 80% in 1970s to under 10% by 2000. The next step was to make China a manufacturing hub, which we know of it as today. For most of Mao's rule, China remained diplomatically and economically isolated from much of the world. Foreign investments were non-existent, and countries' engagement with global trade was almost close to minimal. This inward-looking stance inherently hindered China's economic growth and technological advancement. Deng Xiaoping dramatically reversed this. He saw global engagement as essential for China's modernization. Under his leadership, China established special economic zones, SEZs, in places like and particularly Shenzhen, where foreign investors were given preferential treatment. The first company to set up shop in China was Coca-Cola, and this was followed by many other companies such as the pharma giant AstraZeneca, Volkswagen, IBM, and others. These zones became engines of export-driven growth. The average income in Shenzhen, for instance, went from under $1 a day to over $30,000 a year. It was an economic miracle. Deng Xiaoping also encouraged Chinese students to go abroad and study, which basically was virtually banned under Mao. He also welcomed foreign technology, expertise, and diplomatic ties with major economies. This global integration laid the foundation for China's rise as a manufacturing powerhouse. He also focused immensely on infrastructure, which is critical for the growth in manufacturing. He made massive investments in roads, ports, railways, and power. At the same time, he also continued the massive public investment and emphasis on basic education and vocational training, which was started by Mao. Now, talking about it seems all very simple and easy, I mean, anybody could just do this and grow their economy overnight exponentially, right? So why don't more people and countries do it? Well, it is because what it really comes down to is execution, and that is where China's brilliance lies. Let's take India for instance. India's bureaucracy was often slow and obstructive. Land and labor laws remained rigid, unlike China. Reforms happened in bursts and not in a continuous manner like China. We, in fact, couldn't even implement things which were genuinely great. Case in point, farming laws, which in my opinion were absolutely amazing, but the government failed to implement it and it had to be pulled back. Similarly, a lot of great projects get unnecessarily delayed for a whole ton of reasons, like protests. But China dealt with it all very successfully. By the way, here are the words of Warren Buffett's right-hand man, the late and the great Charlie Munger in this context.
The Indian populace, but the system and the poverty and the corruption and the crazy democratic thing where you let anybody who screams stop all progress, it's hard to get anything done in India, and the bribes are just awful.
But just like the way there are great things about Mao, there are bad aspects about Deng Xiaoping as well. For instance, the violent crackdown on those who opposed his views and those who were pro-democracy. For instance, the Tiananmen Square massacre. Several lost their lives. There was also a lot of corruption within the party and so on. But the biggest downside, in my opinion, was to continue the one-child policy, which basically went on to kill the social structures and also kill the demographic dividend that really led to China's growth. In the recent times, we can also see their build and they will come approach, which was fueled by debt, failing. These two collectively, in my opinion, would eventually lead to the fall of China. But we can save this for another video. If you guys do want me to make a video on that, do let me know in the comment section below. Anyway, India, contrary to China, liberalized much later, in 1991. While it adopted many market reforms, it retained a democratic system, an independent judiciary, and a free press. These were strengths, but they came with policy paralysis, delays, and coalition politics. As a result of this, while India did grow, especially after 2000, it never matched China's pace and scale. But that's not the end of it, and it does not mean that we won't get there. I must mention that the benefits of Deng Xiaoping's reforms didn't show up immediately. Even as of 1997, at the time of his death, the Chinese economy was still less than $1 trillion. But he had done the groundwork that would eventually lead to China becoming what it is today. It started to enjoy the benefits of the eighth wonder of the world, compounding. A lot of what has happened in India over the last few decades, be it the reforms of 1991 under PV Narasimha Rao, the privatization drive started by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, or the several reforms taking place under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, we will see the benefits of all of these play across the next few decades. And trust me when I say this, I genuinely believe that over the next 2, 3, 4, or maybe 5 decades, India would rise to the top. Not number 3, not number 2, but number 1, beating China.